Hello, I'm Philip North and I'm the chair of the Estates Evangelism Task Group, and I'm speaking to you from my house in Burnley. I'd love to be with you, but we're a bit locked down at the moment in Burnley because this part of the country is a COVID hotspot, and it's not hard to see why. Burnley is a really good place to live. There's huge advantages, lovely fresh air, easy access to the countryside, friendly community, great football team, but it faces a range of issues common to many people across this part of the country. Poor quality housing, a culture of low pay in which people need multiple jobs and so can all too easily carry the virus from one place of work to another, dense and overcrowded housing conditions, underlying health issues. All of these make this part of the country a very easy place for the virus to spread. In other words, the underlying problem is quite simply poverty. And I suspect you're dealing with exactly the same issues in many areas where you work. This pandemic is blowing wide open, deep and ingrained inequalities that we've been living with in our country for far too many years, but are now just all too plain to see. Maurice Glassman commented the other day that a new class system is emerging in our country at the moment. Those who can work from home on the one hand, those who cannot work from home on the other. It's all too often the low paid who have to work under dangerous conditions, for whom working from home is simply not an option because of the nature of their employment. And of course, as we're seeing, it's the low paid who are losing their jobs as furlough schemes come to an end. It's the low paid who will take a huge wages cut under the new job protection scheme. It's the low paid who in the months, years ahead, as we deal with the economic fallout of this catastrophic crisis, it's the low paid who'll drift into ever deeper debt and ever deeper poverty. Now, of course, many of the people I'm talking about are your people. They're the people you serve. The efforts made in churches, and especially in estates churches, in responding to the pandemic have been absolutely heroic. They've been completely astonishing. I've heard so many stories of churches finding new ways to pray and worship in the midst of crisis, of churches finding new ways to reach out and serve the people of their communities, new ways to feed the hungry, to get alongside the lonely. There's been incredible agility. So thank you so much to every single one of you, the church leaders I'm speaking to you now, for the incredible efforts that you've made in enabling the church to respond to pandemic, both through service, through proclamation and through worship. It's been extraordinary. And of course, thank you again now for your stamina, because what we're seeing is this was no sprint. We rather idly thought back in March that this would all be over by now, and here we are just in the midst of a second wave. And we'd all have to pick ourselves up and go on, worshipping, serving, proclaiming. That's incredibly precious and important work. There's perhaps been no more important time for Christians to be praying and worshipping and serving. So thank you so much for your work and for your leadership. So your efforts as estates churches are heroic. But of course, as we know, they're also very deeply fragile. There's always a fragility to estates churches, especially to those who are committed above all to serving local people. But that fragility is even plainer to see now as the church deals with the fallout of the financial crisis that's hitting our nation. Dioceses are worried about the bottom line, worried about drops in parish share income, worried about their financial security. And as we make plans in the years ahead and try and deal with these issues, it'll be all too easy once again for estates churches to be the victims who pay the price of crisis. My great fear is that we could see the death of the estates church in the years ahead. After a period of time in which dioceses are once again realising the central importance of ministry to estates, it could become all too easy for a financial crisis to wipe away all that progress, so that we become a church of the wealthy, a church of the well-connected, a church of the middle classes. And that would be a disaster simply because that's not the church of Jesus Christ. So this is where the Estates Evangelism Task Group, which I chair, comes in. In February 2019, the General Synod of the Church of England made an absolutely historic commitment. After a very powerful, moving, intense debate, Synod voted unanimously that as the Church of England, we should have, or work with ecumenical partners to have, a loving, serving, worshipping Christian community on every estate in the country. Every significantly sized estate should have a community of Christians there to worship, to serve, to proclaim. Now, some might argue that in the light of this financial crisis and COVID, that's now an unrealistic goal. It's just simply unaffordable. Well, I want to say it's more important than ever. There's lots of talk about the emerging church, about renewal coming from crisis. If that's going to begin anywhere, it's going to begin on the estates, amongst the deprived, in the places where you work. Jesus located his ministry with the marginalised, and only when we do as he does will we start to change a nation under Christ. It's more important than ever that we're committed to a loving, worshipping, serving Christian community on every significant estate, and that's what we need to achieve together. The Estates Evangelism Task Group is at this very moment developing a new strategy, which is soon going to be launched. And that comes under 4 strands. Let me briefly talk you through them. Our first strand, drawn straight from that synod motion, is to have a worshipping community on every single estate. That means, of course, strengthening and working alongside existing estates churches, but in addition, there are 265 social housing estates with over 1,000 housing units which have no church presence. 265 estates with no Christian presence at all. That's a scandal. Think how many people that is, how many children, how many families, how many older people. Those are rich harvest fields, but there are no labourers there at all. Those estates are full of people who need to know the hope that we only find in Jesus, but there's no one to speak that hope or to live that hope. We need to find affordable, sustainable ways of establishing Christian communities on those estates. That's just so important. So that's our first strand, a worshipping community on every estate. Our second strand is leadership. And this, as we know, is critical. If we're going to have sustainable churches on estates, we must have good, inspired, Christ-centred, faithful, prayerful leaders. Now, there's some really fascinating experiments going on around the country in urban leadership. In this diocese, for example, we have a scheme that we call Empower, in which urban and estates churches can nominate potential lay leaders, perhaps those who lack formal educational background, perhaps those whose confidence is low. And through good quality theological input and formation and hands-on training, they're formed as urban leaders and sent back into their own contexts. There's other dioceses experimenting with similar schemes. We need to do, I think, 2 things under leadership. First of all, we need to encourage the finest leaders the church has got to spend periods of their ministry in our estates parishes. So we're offering our estates churches the very best that the church has. But then secondly, perhaps more excitingly, we need to find ways of raising up, forming, sending local leaders, people born and raised on the estates, people resident on the estates, so that they can sing the gospel in a language that local people can understand. We need inspired and inspiring leadership. So that's our second strand. Our third strand is effective partnerships and resources. The Estates Evangelism Task Group has no staff to speak of. It has no money, no budget. So how on earth do we deliver? Well, the answer is partnership. By forming partners with those who are equally passionate about this work. A key partner is, of course, NECN, whose work and whose revival in recent years has been so inspiring to see. But we have, to begin with, a partnership of a number of charitable groups, of parachurch organisations, of resource providers, of church planters. And then we also have a network of partners in Anglican dioceses around the country. And by working together, we can be ambitious and bold in delivering our agenda. We need to raise up a network of people who are speaking up powerfully for estates churches And we want to encourage those partners to do even more to resource estates churches of all denominations. So that's our third strand, effective partnerships and resources. And our fourth strand is our young people, children, youth and schools. As you all know from first-hand experience, life is hard for many of our young people on our estates at the moment. When there are thriving, healthy churches on our estates, there is so much we can do. There are some really good resources out there for young people on our estates. We have a network of church schools. We can run intern programs such as the Ministry Experience Scheme, which can resource ministry to children and youth and schools. So many of our estates churches are reaching out effectively to young people, especially the newer ones, and we need to be both serving and speaking good news to those young people. So those are our four strands in this new strategy: a worshipping community on every estate, leadership, effective partnerships and resources, children, youth and schools, and we need you to join in to make strategy reality. Your work and ministry matters more than you can know. Churches grow, national churches grow, not when they develop clever techniques, not when they talk a good game. Churches grow when they hear the cry of the poor and respond. Churches grow when they feed the hungry and speak up for justice. Only when we live out the gospel will people be interested in hearing it. So thank you for your work. You're part of a great wave of people up and down the country passionate about the health of churches on our estates. So thanks, keep going, and together let's renew this nation under Christ, starting on the margins. Thank you for listening. God bless you all.
So many words have been spoken about the pandemic, but let me begin with an image today. What happened was like a giant earthquake. Most, but not all of us, were inside as the ground shook beneath our feet. As it subsided, we began tentatively to step outside. There was masonry all over the place. An earthquake is indiscriminate as buildings are levelled. The temptation is to run to the first piece of rubble and try and move it to find out what's beneath. The smarter thing is to walk round, take in the scene, and listen out for the quiet cries for help that lie beneath some pieces of rubble. Those bleeding from superficial injuries may need first aid, but the ones who are trapped are most at risk. That's our task today. We're not coming out of the pandemic, it's reasserting itself like the aftershocks from an earthquake. So there will be further casualties. But one thing in particular shows, despite first appearances and the way an earthquake levels things, it actually hits poorer places harder because they are less well built and poorer people live almost literally on top of one another. This is pretty much what we've found out today with the pandemic. Though all cohorts have lost out because a tiny virus does not differentiate, turns out that a pandemic works like every other crisis in life. It hits the most vulnerable hardest. Older people, poorer people, those with underlying health problems or from a BAME background, and especially when more than one of those identities combine. If you live on an estate, rent from a negligent private landlord, have no garden to call your own, are sharing bedrooms within your property, lockdown was simply harder. It's been said that the new definition of working class is that you have to leave home to work. Yes, that's a generalisation, but it has made poorer people more vulnerable to the virus as they made daily trips on public transport and were exposed to a wider range of people. But for the majority of people who live on, it's the economy that will really hurt them. 0 hours contracts, punishing, sometimes humiliating jobs, no loyalty to employees if they are even called employees, and no savings. The last decade of austerity gave us a new term for such people, the precariat. There's no certainty. People are watching over their backs all the time for something to go wrong. This kind of precarious life more properly belongs in the animal world, where creatures have to stay one step ahead of a predator. This should not be the condition of a human being. But their numbers are going to grow, all the more so as the online giants and those who control the gig economy are the big winners from the pandemic. This kind of poverty is linked to mental illness. If we didn't know the statistics, we could guess them. There are signs that mental health may rise up the political agenda. We can be sure that future generations who are much more open about the state of their minds will make it a priority. But as it rises up the agenda, we must make sure to distinguish between two different states. Mental illness is a diagnosable illness of the mind. Those who experience conditions like schizophrenia, clinical depression, bipolar disorder, panic, anxiety, and eating disorders are some of the most unwell people in the country, and their numbers being added to by the pandemic. In trying to deal with the rise in mental illness, attention has been drawn to mental well-being, a good state of mind where we're not afflicted by nagging bad doubts and thoughts. Unpleasant as these are and worthy of attention, they should be distinguished from clinically diagnosable mental illnesses. We are not all in the same boat, and it's disrespectful of the very ill to blur the two, putting them at risk of not being taken seriously enough. The low-grade sadness I have felt through the pandemic is nothing compared to the crushing depression of others, where they feel they've been left in a dark room and the key thrown away. If I can put this bluntly, we must not let mental illness become a branch of middle-class wellness industry. The growth in the economically and mentally vulnerable are big outcomes from the pandemic, and they will be prevalent on our estates. In responding to the virus, I've suggested to churches in Rochester that they might employ the 3 R's: recovery, reimagination, and reach. There's a clear work of recovery. Though we may have been unsatisfied with aspects of our churches beforehand, there's a lot we need to return to and to return to well. This includes public worship, focused pastoral care on those who have or are losing out, understanding and steadying church finances, assessing the new actual size of the volunteer base, and deciding what to do with existing projects in the light of all that. There's also a work of reimagining church. I know that some will groan on hearing this. There is understandable weariness about being endlessly told that everything presents us with a fantastic opportunity to do something new for God that will make the difference we've been waiting for. And I want to be sensitive to this. I'm guessing not all those who returned from exile wanted to be frantically rebuilding the walls and enforcing the covenant with the relish and work ethic of Nehemiah in Jerusalem. I suspect we'd each have some sympathy with them. But those with energy will want to spend that energy. The historian Margaret Macmillan, who has spent time reflecting on responses to major crises, has said, "Invest all the resources you can in figuring out what you're up against." Similarly, the renowned geographer Jared Diamond has said the challenge for institutions is, and I quote, "to figure out which parts of their identity are already functioning well and don't need changing, and which parts are no longer working and do need changing. So there is a task of reimagining church, and it can be done in bite sizes that don't make us choke. We need to listen to people's stories and assess community needs, realign our ministry in the light of these, attract volunteers from outside the church as well as inside to assist with bottom-up creative social action, to end some things so that new plans can be made and resourced, and to cluster better with other churches to enable all these. In particular, we need the better joining up of word and action, evangelism and community engagement, to be holistic in mission. We're all aware that trust levels in the professions have dipped in recent years. What most have missed, but which has been uncovered by the politics academic William Davis, is that trust levels have fallen most in those jobs that depend most on words: politicians, journalists, estate agents, clergy. In contrast, trust levels have held up best in those professions that care for, nurture, or protect the human body: doctors, nurses, teachers, the armed services. Words come cheaply today. Lies pervade our public spaces. Unless these words are supported by tangible, sincere actions demonstrating care for people's bodies, they will be ignored. This is hardly a revelation for the church. That's the gospel. It was authenticated in the early church by the way its preaching was joined to healing and acts of charity. Any church that longs to make its impact in the local community must make the same joining. The pandemic, in its malign way, has simply reinforced this point. The third component of a post-virus church is a new awareness of its reach. This includes understanding the profile and needs of those who prefer to engage online, creating digital capacity, responding to new or deepened community needs in the coming recession, a renewed commitment to pastoral care, especially among those who've lost out. And that includes that greater focus on mental health, which is a bodily question. As numbers are added to the precariat in this recession, many people will be experiencing deep needs for the first time. They'll find that the systems they imagined were in place to look after them are more precarious than they imagined. The famous safety net for the needy has lots of holes in it. It's hard for some to access these systems because they require verbal and computer literacy, and after a few weeks it feels like a game of snakes and ladders where they keep landing on the snakes. The system is faceless and it feels like no one really cares about you. Our systems can leave much to be desired at times, but there is another side to the story. There are charities, advice services, information leaflets and points. Lots of people want to offer the support that others need to get through. They will listen, give time and space, and have helpful things to say. That there are so many third sector services shows just how much love and care there is. Sometimes it feels there are too many services and that they don't talk to one another. If so, that's where community hubs come in. Churches can bring these groups together in one space that is visible and accessible. Clients can see what's on display and talk face to face with real people, not automated voices. The agencies, in coming together in one space, can also make contact with one another and the local church can have its space and credibility in marrying human need to practical support. That's one step churches can take if it doesn't already exist. It's one specific response to a puzzling and disturbing crisis. How parishes engage with their estates right now is a similar issue to their care homes. Both are places of significantly increased need. But the parishes best placed to help are those which have an existing relationship with the estate or care home. It will not be easy to generate one quickly in a socially distanced world. There's one final thing I'd like to say, and that concerns inequality and identity. There's been much talk in recent years of the white working classes who are believed to have been overlooked, patronised, or even sneered at by so-called affluent metropolitan elites. Issues of identity came to the fore again during lockdown with the appalling death of George Floyd in Minneapolis and many protests of visceral anger. That led to a provocative counter-response in some places, symbolised most acutely here by the light aircraft that flew a banner "White Lives Matter" over the Manchester City football stadium, apparently devised by fans of Burnley FC. Issues of identity are fundamental in life and have produced terrible injustices through the eras. But issues of class remain important, and they cross ethnicities. White working classes exist, but so do black working classes and Asian working classes. In fact, the pandemic has shown how vulnerable BAME working classes have been to the virus. To be working class is to be economically poorer than the middle class. The working class does not comprise one ethnicity. To suggest it does permits some people to ignore it as if it's no more than a white grudge at work. In that way, issues of inequality can be conveniently sidelined by some people. Part of our prophetic role in this era is to talk about the ethnically diverse working class and the issues of poverty that assail many within it. It is a fundamental part of our witness to and support of all those who live on our estates.
Hello, I'm Jonathan and I'm a team vicar at Church of the Cross on Thames Mead in southeast London, which is the biggest estate parish in the UK at roughly 52,000 and going up and up and up. I'm in a team of 4 churches, and I've been asked to come and do this shortish video just to give some personal testimony about what the last 6 months has been like. You'll hear I have a stammer. I'll get on to that at the end, and all of this as well I will also touch on at the end of this film. So this is just my own little snapshot. What I did, what I'm doing now, things I've learnt, and what could come next. So where did it all start? Well, I guess for all of us, it happened really, really quick, and it went from basically normal to lock down within a few days. Our rug got pulled from under us, and we hadn't really seen it coming, and we had a learning curve like the eye goose, like, right, online church now, off you go. And we're going, what? Didn't do that at college. Okay, what and how and what? Right, one of the opening things is Whiskin. 2 is all the IT things on Amazon and stuff sold out. You can't get it. So I ended up with what I have here, which of course you can't see. It's my iPhone on a tripod. That was what I've had the past 6 months. What else? Well, I was scrambling round to get the church contact list together, of course, which I did, but only just. And I then realised I have people linked to church through things like the hiring groups, the AA group, the domestic violence groups, the mums and toddlers groups, the back to work groups. I haven't got their contact lists, and I worked out I couldn't get them due to GDPR rules. I hadn't thought of that. And then it was too late. In comes that deadline, and I just had to start running something somehow. And at the start, it was really challenging, but I kind of got there in the end. In the first few weeks, the pattern would be that I would do lunch time short reflections and a thing on Sunday. And as through the weeks things inched their way back to normal, I wound that back a bit. So by June I wasn't doing Fridays. The end of July was Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and currently I'm back at the old pattern of Tuesdays and Wednesdays. This is because people were learning how you lived with COVID, so the time they had early on, they haven't got now. People learned how you worked online, and so they had less and less time. What's the reach been? Well, I seem to have caught my whole church near enough. I've also had people tuning in from Australia, Denmark, and from others in the team parish. So those churches also tuned in, which was nice. But one thing hit me. I would think 8 out of 10 of our church work shifts, weird with times, odd patterns, and I've worked out they watch things 2 or 3 days after I've done them. At the actual time, I could have 5 households watching, but by the end of the week I've had perhaps 20 hits. Some days could be around 12. By the middle of the week it's 30 or 40. People watch afterwards. So what does that say? I think I have to keep some sort of online thing going even after we get back. That's a thing to juggle. There is a need there. What else? Well, I strive to keep in touch with each household in the church at least once a week, and I kept that up until about July. But after this, 2 things happened. One was, I think people were calmer, happier, more settled, and if I'm honest, I was worn out by it. Very, very tiring. So it's September now, and I'm really back to just keeping in touch with those I have to and those who ask. But I have to also reflect, who called me up? And you know, a handful did, but actually generally it was thin, if I'm honest. Now, you might be thinking, what's all this? Where am I? Well, I'm in my house and this is the office, and I've run all the services here since March, and from the start I just didn't want to be a head on a screen type thing. I was wanting a thing that was more aesthetic, even if the words go backwards. I aim to head on a screen. You'll also hear I have a stammer, and I have to own up. When you're there with your own church in your own building, that's okay, but putting that out there online was a step for me, I have to say. Quite scary, which then leads to the next point I have. Personally, this has been a really uncomfortable time. I felt called to the role as a vicar to spend time with people and being with people. I now rarely am. The whole thing around motivation has been up and down. I've spent nearly all of the last 6 months completely outside of my comfort zones, skill zones, gifting zones. And it's been wearing as well. But I'm here still, and God is good. Just to end, going back to the actual church and thinking about the community of Church of the Cross, there were things that I saw and I encountered, and I've just sort of put them out there for you. Not all people have Wi-Fi in their house, and they have to pay to use data. And if you're broke, that's a cost you often can't pay. Hence, it's hard to then have online church. Of course, you've got things like loss of jobs. You have the sad increase in domestic violence. One of the other things is we are majority BAME, and this whole thing has hit that group as a whole harder, and they're very cautious about how and if you come back to church. Another thing, we're in a cash economy that puts cash in the plate. Of course, we haven't got that, so our giving has gone. We also got 2/3 of our income through rental. That's gone, and we have, since the spring, we've lost about 70% of our income. I can't work out how we'll get that back, at least short term. I could go on, but I won't. I can't tell you what the next year holds, and actually no one can, but God knows, and he hasn't been caught out by this. And I pray that as we go on through this for the next year, we will have open ears and eyes and hearts to hear his guidance for where we are and our context. Thank you for watching. I hope this sparks some questions and thoughts within you. Thank you.